Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the first Hartford Courant Key Issues Forum for the year 2007. I'm Tom Condon, editor of the Courant's Place section, and I will welcome you to our forum titled Blog Nation, Who Are These Guys and What Is Their Plan? With today's program, the Key Issues Forum begins its 21st year as one of the Courant's community outreach activities. So please let me introduce our editor, our publisher, president, and CEO, Steve Carver, who's right here, Steve, and our editorial page editor, Bob Schreff. Now, three of our panelists wrote essays on blogging that appeared in last Sunday's commentary section. These, if you missed them, they're excellent, and they're available on the table over there. Also, CTN, our friends at Connecticut Network, are taping today's program. It will be shown Saturday night at 7:30, or at about 7:30, following the CTN Capitol Report. Also, Fox61.com will have highlights of today's program on the website this afternoon. Now, with that, let me begin by saying I don't know a lot about blogging, but I do know this, that the word wasn't even coined until 1999. It was a blend, or a portmanteau, if you will, you crossword puzzle fans, of web and log. And in that year, there were only 23 of them, 23 of these websites. By the middle of 2007, there are expected to be 100 million worldwide. I also know that blogging and related internet uses came of age in 2004 with the Howard Dean campaign and with one telling incident in the John Kerry campaign. On the advice of the Democratic Brain Trust, Kerry did not respond quickly to the infamous Swift boat attack because it would have dignified something, quote, that only the bloggers had. I will be seriously amazed if that mistake is ever made again. As we'll hear, the role of bloggers increased in the Lamont Lieberman campaign 2006 and in other campaigns across the country. In addition to politics, we're now seeing blogs in advertising, colleges, 100 other places. Now, to explore this phenomenon, we really have an outstanding panel this morning. And let me introduce them in alphabetical order. From your left, Chris Bigelow, a.k.a. Genghis Khan, founder of the blog CT Local Politics. Colin McEnroe, radio host, columnist, author, playwright, explorer, and crack shot, but for our purposes, blogger and teacher of a course on blogging. Melissa J. Ryan, a.k.a. Caffeinated Geek Girl. Melissa is a blogger on her own site and a front-page contributor for Connecticut Local Politics. Matt Stoller writes for MyDD.com, is a Washington-based blogging expert, frequent contributor to many major websites, and commentator on blogging. And Tim Tagaris, a late but welcome addition to the panel. Tim ran the Ned Lamont Internet operation, has worked for Howard Dean at the Democratic National Committee, Senator Sherrod Brown, and other candidates, and is now Internet Communications Director for Senator Chris Dodd's presidential campaign. Colin, would you start us off with kind of a primer about this whole phenomenon, maybe a simplified version of what you tell your students on the first day of class?
Right. There'll be a final paper. First of all, blogging is one sort of set of stops and keys on a big, huge pipe organ that is this kind of information revolution that we're living through right now, which I really do believe is probably, it's almost impossible to overstate what's happening. I mean, there's sort of the evolution of spoken language, the evolution of written language, maybe movable type, and now this. This is so big, I mean, just even the numbers that Tom was quoting, and even the idea that somebody sitting in Newington, Connecticut can, with no filtering whatsoever, put something up on a website that is theoretically, anyway, available to hundreds of millions of people from here to Beijing, and that information of almost any kind is available to that person through the Internet. It's almost impossible to overstate what the implications of that are, and we're not here to talk about that today anyway. And then, so that's what we're talking about here is a subset of that. And then there's blogging, and blogging is a much vaster thing than what's represented here on the panel. Blogging really is allows people to publish on almost any subject, and they do publish on almost any subject. I mean, there are blogs. I don't know. You know, there are blogs. There's more than one blog devoted to people's erotic considerations of William Shatner. You know, I mean, there probably are. That's probably in double digits. You know, I mean, people blog about every single possible subject, and without filter, and that's probably the most interesting part about this whole thing. You know, I mean, I was thinking this morning, Tom and I went into the newspaper business shortly after the Civil War, and in order to get anything into the paper, I mean, you know, you have to go through this. I was thinking, we worked for this guy named Stan Simon, who's an editor we often thought about killing, and it was one of those things where if zombies rose from the dead, you know, and clogged I-84, you know, marching down the road, pulling people out of their cars and eating them, and you went and wrote the story, and the lead was, you know, traffic on I-84 was tied up in a bizarre incident involving people who rose from the dead. Stan would say, how do you know it's bizarre? They may not think it's bizarre. It may be what zombies do all the time. And then you take bizarre out, and he'd say, well, now it's not that interesting. And it was sort of this long, kind of complicated process of getting anything into the newspaper. And a newspaper is a pretty immediate medium. Well, blogging, you write it, you think it, you click, it's up there. And that's the real miracle of this, and that anybody can do it, that anybody who wants to do it can do it. You don't have to qualify. You don't have to get hired. And that's an incredibly empowering thing. And so the subset of blogging that we're talking about here today mainly is of a political nature. And in some ways, you live in a place that is one of the real epicenters for this, in the sense that we've just lived through a campaign. The Lieberman-Lamont campaign was a real sort of test of what that's like. What happens when a really active, involved, large blogging community gets heavily involved in a campaign? And I would assume that that's one of the things you're going to hear about today. And I think the answer was that an awful lot of people decided that people like me and Tom and some of you sitting out there, that we weren't doing a good enough job of getting certain kinds of issues out in front of the public, and that they could do a better job. I always say the difference between me and a blogger is I get paid. And other than that, I don't have any qualifications that they don't have. And so we saw that. We saw an active citizenry decide to sort of take control of a portion of the process of distributing information. And I think that's what we're here to talk about today, and I'll shut up.
No. Well, let me just follow up. In your essay, you mentioned Deadwood. When I first glanced at the word, I thought it was another attack on the Rowland administration. But what is that? Is this kind of the free and wild west out there?
Yeah, my classes get really tired of hearing about this thing because I use it all year long. But I mean, my argument basically is that what was the American frontier? It was a place that you could go. You know, I mean, one of the problems with the American dream and the New World was that it got calcified on the East Coast pretty quickly. And after a while, Boston wasn't that different from London. You know, you were still pretty much a prisoner of your class and your family connections and stuff like that. So people began moving to a frontier where, in fact, they could earn their place more by what they could do. And frontiers are characterized by a certain rawness, a certain inventiveness, a certain spontaneity. People often go for their guns rather quickly to settle a dispute. And anybody can rise to almost any station, once again, based on what he or she can do, as opposed to who or she was born, as opposed to what station he or she was born into. And that's why I'm very intrigued by the frontier analogy. But just very quickly, another interesting analogy would be to pamphleteers and to Thomas Paine, because once again, that was a time when, the American Revolution was a time, and the years preceding it was a time where people thought, you know what, I could publish, I could be a pamphleteer, I could publish. Most of them initially were not getting paid. I think Thomas Paine was the first person or close to it to realize there might be some commercial possibilities in it. And it was also very much informed by an idea that informs blogging. That kind of Lockean idea that received authority was a lot of crap, that I know as much as the king knows. The fact that he's the king is a completely arbitrary thing, that I'm not the prisoner of some kind of received tradition. In fact, what I know inside myself is as significant as anything else. Very much that kind of Enlightenment idea.
Good. Melissa, now Melissa works as a museum consultant, lives in Fairfield. How'd you get into this?
Well, I just found the idea very intriguing of having a site, and I started Caffeinated Geek Girl with no plan, no goal, just to kind of put stuff out there. It's interesting how that particular site has evolved, especially as I became less anonymous over time, less and less anonymous until this weekend where that just died. And then I'm new to Connecticut. I've lived here about 4 years. And I started following politics not through local media, but through the blog Connecticut Local Politics. I couldn't find much information about municipal elections in my own community, but I could go to Connecticut Local Politics, and there it was. So when Chris expanded the site and called on people to write about politics, I emailed immediately and said, can I please be a part of this? And that's when it all just exploded and a whole new world of possibilities and focus opened up to me.
Right. Now, respond to this. The columnist George Will recently cited research indicating that 76% of bloggers blog to document their personal experiences, which he said was okay, but, quote, not demanding or especially admirable. Do you agree or disagree?
I think I agree. There is a limited audience for people who blog about their personal life, particularly as there are more and more venues. You can go on MySpace. There are so many ways to just put your life out there. So I think there is a limit to that particular type of blogging.
So, yeah, if you go to William Shatner Jones, that doesn't have a wide audience.
William Shatner, I think there's unlimited potential, obviously.
There's an expectation, if I can just interject, there's an expectation within blogging that there will be an interleaving of your personal experiences and your political ideas if you're a political blogger. It's not true with every single political blogger. But, David Broder doesn't write, geez, woke up feeling like crap today, and I need a hip replacement, and as far as McCain goes, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But that's very much the way a blogger might do that. There's an expectation that you will not separate your personal life from what you're blogging about.
Right, and a lot of times when I cover a political event, I don't think about it and, the who, what, when, where, and why, but what was my experience and what would someone who couldn't attend the event or who doesn't normally go to these things, what would they want to know?
Okay, good. Well, the traditional journalist would try to do the same thing, I hope. Tim, calling on your experience in the Lamont campaign and other campaigns, how do you set up a campaign web operation? What are your goals? What are you trying to do?
Well, how about that? That's a little loud. The Lamont campaign, it was a lot more than just the blogs. It's what everyone talked about, and they certainly were a huge part of our success online. But there's the website, there's the email operation. A lot of people like to point to the fact that we ended up raising about $2 million online for a man worth about a lot more than that, which is no small feat. But most of that came from email. So there are a lot of different components to it. But it's ultimately our success online wasn't because of me or because of the campaign, but because of a terrific candidate, because we had a campaign staff that recognized there was a role for the online piece in every traditional campaign department, whether it was the communications director, Liz DuPont-Deal, who I think I saw here earlier, recognizing that the blogs can play a role in helping to shape the message in the traditional media, or the obvious fundraising role, or a field component, which maybe we'll talk about later. So that's where it began, was with a recognition within the campaign, and people like Tom Swan, the campaign manager, that there was a role. And then ultimately it was the work and advocacy by people like Matt and Melissa, and Chris, even though I think he endorsed Schlesinger on the day before the election.
I guess somebody named Genghis Khan can't be a liberal.
And it's people like Connecticut Blog and Connecticut Bob who would attend events, Joe Lieberman events and Ned Lamont events. In fact, I think Connecticut Blog was the first person to get Joe on audio or video talking about how he would consider running as an independent. And that was something that was at a meeting that they excluded traditional media from. And Al Robinson is his name, snuck in with his little handheld recording device and put it out there online. And next thing you know, there was an explosion. it was Colin on his, there's a real crossing of mediums. It was Colin on his radio show where Senator Lieberman kind of flipped out on him. That was one of the catalysts for people online who had been itching to get at Senator Lieberman and potentially beat him, to recognize that maybe there's a little concern here. And so it doesn't necessarily come. It doesn't come from the campaign at its best. It comes from people like Matt and Melissa.
Well, do you get new people into the process that instead of the normal 20% of people who follow the issue?
People care. People care, and I think that a lot of times the traditional media, with all due respect to the current and all the people want more information than they're being given. People want more than the 15-second talking point of Joe Lieberman saying, "No one wants to bring the troops home more than me," and then it just gets let go. So people want more, and what you get online is you get people who are exploring these issues and these candidates in more than 15-second sound bites or a finite number of column inches, and are able to do it repeatedly and in real time over the course of a day and a week and a month in a campaign.
Okay. Thanks. Chris, you wrote an essay last fall suggesting that the bloggers were a factor but not a decisive factor in the Lamont primary campaign. Do you still feel that way?
Yes. They were certainly a factor. And really what I kind of feel was that even before the Connecticut blogosphere really started to go after Joe Lieberman, that there was this groundswell of anger against Joe Lieberman that had been...
Over the war mostly?
It goes a long way back. That there have been Democrats in Connecticut who have been very dissatisfied with Lieberman. They've been dissatisfied with him for a long time. And as time went on, and he would do more and more things, like getting up on the floor of the Senate and criticizing President Clinton, and all of these other things that really kind of irritated Democrats and Connecticut Democrats, that more and more of them became annoyed with him over time. And really what happened was that and of course when his support for the war was kind of like, it was the end for a lot of people. They just had it with him. And a lot of that found expression online. But it would not have taken off online the way that it did. And it took off online in a huge way. It would not have taken off online the way that it did without there being something there beforehand, without there being a significant portion of people who were really, really angry with Joe Lieberman. So what you saw that this was... You saw that this was expressed online by people who were really active in the party, really cared a lot about the party, and you saw that these blogs were being read and disseminated by people who really cared. But I don't think that blogs can drive a campaign all by themselves. There has to be something else there. A blog readership is simply not that large to be able to get like 30, 40, 50,000 votes. It's just not that big. So, I mean, the people that are reading and writing blogs, they're the real activists. They're the ones who are committed to politics, or the political junkies, really. Without them, maybe the Lamont campaign wouldn't have taken off in quite such a big way. But I think that anger with Joe Lieberman was still there, and I think that there still would have been a Lamont campaign. I think there still would have been significant support for it, even without blogs existing.
Okay. Good. Matt? Colin mentioned before movable type. I want to try to get a sense of the breadth of the impact here. I mean, is there a parallel? I mean, movable type, motion pictures, ESPN. I mean, in your sense, to what degree are bloggers influencing public opinion and public policy?
Well, I think there's two overall trends that we should probably disassociate. One is this sort of larger cultural trend of the internet re-empowering the public, which is really what's going on. Whether you're talking about the frontier or pamphleteering, you're talking about the public returning to our political, economic, and cultural institutions and really threatening the elites that have been running those institutions just through their sheer existence and through a different way of operating. And then you're dealing with the political, and that's different. Because what we've seen over the last 6 to 8, maybe you could extend it back 15 years, is sort of an extraordinary, revolutionary group of leaders who have come in from the right seeking to genuinely transform the way that the American Republic operates. And in a lot of ways, the liberal emergence online is as a result of that. So conservatives are not actually online in a particularly significant manner, and that's not inherent to the internet. We have to start asking the question of why it is that liberals are online. So there's sort of two pieces here. There's the cultural, and then there's the just direct political piece.
Okay.
Although I would just sort of say one thing, which is one thing that I sort of have come to believe over the years is Marshall McLuhan got everything right. I mean, Marshall McLuhan turns out to have been like much smarter than we thought in 1978. And in saying that the medium is the message, one of the things that I think that he fundamentally was arguing is that every medium has an essence or a quintessence. And for example, talk radio is fundamentally conservative, and it always has been. I mean, it's always been a better way of moving conservative information. And there are some positable reasons for that, but I'm not even going to go into them. So far, anyway, the quintessence, the footprint of the internet, and I'm not suggesting that it won't change, but in a very McLuhan-esque sense, blogging, I would agree, has been more of a liberal phenomenon than a conservative phenomenon. That seems to be very much, at least initially, it's part of the DNA.
I'm not sure that I agree with that about talk radio. FDR was the pioneer of using radio in
I start with
political.
Joe Pine.
I mean, there were a substantial number of liberal radio hosts in the 70s that were taken off the air. And just in general, when you take broadcast media and you change the ownership structure, the way that it's been consolidated, what happens is that it's not just liberal voices, it's diverse voices get moved off of them, as a lot of us, I think, understand. In terms of the larger cultural impact, this is not a broadcast medium, and that's, I think, what's significant. This is actually the public having the capacity to organize and to speak back to the sort of elites that are organizing our culture and our politics. And it's extremely significant. Marshall McLuhan would probably have a lot of really interesting things to say and he'd probably say them in a very badly written manner. But at this point, if sort of to talk about how he thinks about it, I would say that it's no longer that the medium, the medium is the message. It's now that your supporters or your members are the message. So that individuals create the message through individuals, through the trust that they bring to bear through their social networks. They're spreading content, they're spreading message, and it's no longer coming from received authority, as you pointed out with, the same analogy with pamphleteers and all that.
Right. There is a substantial conservative blogosphere out there, though. I mean, conservative bloggers helped end Dan Rather's career, for example.
That was really political operatives, not conservative bloggers, using their standard talk radio, Fox News model for putting pressure, Drudge Report on the media. It really didn't. It's not clear where that came from. It was originally planted on a site called freerepublic.com, and I don't think there's any. It's not clear. People somehow became experts in typography. These right wingers, and forgive me for being cynical, but I just don't believe it. I really believe it was planted. Now, yes, it came out online, but I think that was just sort of ginned up. I mean, there's been a 30-year campaign against Dan Rather from the right.
And Matt can tell you more about the size of the conservative blogosphere and its readership compared to just an individual site like Daily Kos, which will generate about 600,000, 700,000 unique visitors a day. And I don't even think the top 5 conservative blogs added together equal that. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a substantial. I mean, one of the problems is that there's not a lot of good liberal content out there. I mean, the argument that the right wing has made for, since Spiro Agnew has been that the media is liberal. And that's convinced a lot of editors and publishers to put pressure and journalists themselves to train themselves not to appear liberal. What that's done is it's opened up a market for people who want credible information about what's going on and information that will tell you that somebody is not telling the truth, which journalists no longer do. And that's sort of one of the reasons why liberal content is emergent, why a lot of these sites have substantial readership and influence. Whereas the conservatives, there's already, if you want to watch conservative content or listen to it or read it or, engage in some way, go to the bookstore, there's plenty of conservative content, partisan Republican content out there. And there just hasn't been for probably since, I don't know, 1980. Maybe you could bring it back to 1968. There just hasn't been a lot of good liberal content out there.
You could also make the argument that any new medium kind of just sluices in there and fills whatever people perceive as a vacuum. And that there was an explosion in American commercial talk radio during the 1990s, led by Rush Limbaugh, but there were a lot of other followers and imitators and stuff like that, because of at least a perception that the media was liberal and that a certain kind of voice was going unheard. And I think it's probably no accident that this explosion in blogging has been primarily, but you were correct, not overwhelmingly, but primarily liberal, because in fact there was a sense anyway that for all the things that Matt just said, there was a dominant conservative voice, and pretty soon the political process, at least at the national level, seemed to be locked up by Republicans too. So yeah, there was a new kind of guerrilla-style medium, and guess who grabbed it? The people who needed it the most.
And I think it's interesting, though, because it seems to be changing a little bit, at least here in Connecticut. One thing that I have noticed lately is that back in 2005, if you were starting a blog, chances are it's going to be a liberal blog. 2006, same thing. But now in 2007, I'm noticing that a lot of the new blogs that I'm seeing in Connecticut start up, they tend to be conservative blogs. So what we're seeing now, I wonder, it might have to do with the fact that people who really, really want to blog may feel that there's a sense of disenfranchisement, that they feel that they're disenfranchised somehow. And who's feeling disenfranchised in Connecticut right now? Well, it's a lot of conservatives who think that they are cut out of the political process, that they have no control. Now, a lot of them are very angry with Governor Rell over her budget. They have no control over spending. They have no control over social policy. So now you have a lot of people who feel like they don't have a voice, and now they're expressing themselves online. So while the blogosphere in Connecticut has been primarily liberal for the past 2 years, I think it is starting to change right now, and it has a lot to do with disenfranchisement.
Okay. Anyone on the panel, let me talk a little bit about accuracy and ethics. Traditional media has kind of banged out a system over the years of standards of accuracy and ethics. I mean, you can't make up quotes, and you can't be on the take, or you can't have conflicts of interest, etc. The Jason Blairs get caught. Now, in keeping with Holland's frontier analogy, is there any law west of the Pecos here? I mean,
yes.
I don't.
If
or is it important? There was a column in the Times the other day.
I mean, no offense, but that question is crazy. I don't see a real system of ethics in journalism. I mean, you're talking about someone, Michael Gordon just published a front page story on how using administration sources, anonymous sources on Iran, he co-authored a substantial number of pieces with Judy Miller. I mean, this is the idea, and breaking the New York Times' own policies on sourcing. George Will, who you brought up earlier, helped Reagan with his debate prep and then complimented Reagan afterwards in the post-debate spin. I mean, to say that journalists have a system of ethics is just false. It's just not true. I mean, I sort of feel like this argument that journalists have this system of ethics which they care very deeply about and don't even vote, some of them, is really just an attempt to mask a larger conversation about journalism that has never happened and that really needs to happen.
What was Geek Girl?
Your readership is your check and balance. If I make a mistake, within an hour, I will have 50 emails in my inbox telling me so. There will be 100 comments telling me so. They keep you honest. You are only as valid as your readers give you credit for. And when you do make a mistake, they will come down on you.
All right. I think that's true. Your credibility is sort of your family jewel. If you violate it, you're gone.
But, I'm going to take issue with that, too, just because I'm taking issue with everything this morning.
Go ahead, Matt.
I know that if I pander to my readership, if I tell them what they want to hear about, Democrats doing good things or Republicans being bad, I'll tend to get a positive response. And, they know that, too. And I don't do it because I don't feel like it's appropriate. I don't feel like it's honest. And the same danger in mass media exists on blogs, which is that you can sort of link hoard. You can try to get traffic using any tactic you want. And as long as the financial structure in blogging is similar to the financial structure in media, which is just widespread attention, a sort of NBC model as opposed to HBO model, then you're going to see similar pressures in the blogosphere, although what you will also see is a lot of pressure from readership. But I certainly know that right-wing readers do not hold they don't hold their bloggers accountable. They can say anything they want, and the authoritarian impulses in the right will allow them to get away with it and to increase their credibility.
And I think a problem with the readership of blogs tends to be, and you're kind of alluding to it now, is that they actually kind of object to any kind of measured analysis of anything. I mean, I found that if I wrote something, I mean, I was notoriously aggressively critical of Lieberman throughout the entire campaign. If I wrote anything that was the slightest bit doubting of Lamont or the slightest bit, I wrote a piece in Salon right after the primary, which, reflected all of my views about Lieberman, but apparently not viciously enough. And I was just torn apart in the comment threads as some kind of Lieberman tool because, in fact, I wasn't sufficiently vicious. And to me, that's one of the problems with responding to your readership. Your readership is asking you basically to be crazy.
I've been meaning to talk to you about your puff pieces about Lieberman.
I knew it.
One thing that it is, and both of you have been talking about this, is that there's kind of a divide in the online world. There's a liberal blogosphere that's way over here, and there's a conservative blogosphere that's way over here, and they don't talk to one another. And what happens is that they kind of feed off of each other. They kind of feed off of themselves. I mean, is what happens is that someone will come up with a story, and it'll be repeated and exaggerated throughout one of these two areas, and they don't talk to one another at all.
Except on your site.
And yeah, that's one of the things that I try to do. We really are becoming more and more divided as a society. Maybe we don't have conservative friends or liberal friends. Maybe we don't live in the same town that a lot of people of different political persuasions live in. One of the things that I try to do is I try to have people actually talk to one another. And that's one of the things that keeps me honest, is that I can't pander to anybody because then I'll have half of my audience get annoyed with me. There are a lot of conservatives that comment on my site. There are a lot of liberals that comment on my site. And there are a lot of moderates. I did a poll the other day, and it turns out that there's quite a few liberals, about, half as many conservatives and a ton of moderates.
And an overwhelming number of men.
That is interesting, yeah. We found that like 80% of our audience was men, and most of them lived in Hartford County.
What he has tried to do is really remarkable, and I don't even know how many parallels Nat might know or Tim might know how many parallels exist across the country, but what he is trying to do, he is like the school teacher, or in his case the librarian, who moved to Deadwood and wound up trying to become the mayor of this essentially kind of lawless community. He is really trying to create an environment where everybody's kind of welcome and that there's some kind of balance and that people aren't too aggressively horrible to one another, and he's constantly having to readjust the model for that to see if there's some way to make a new rule that makes it a little bit better. And it's a very valiant effort, and I think it really has paid off. I think you really have a site where people do meet in a way that they don't meet very often in the blogosphere.
And it's also a site that I don't think would work nationally, and I don't even think would work in a larger state.
I wonder if it would, because the thing is that the difference between liberals and conservatives in Connecticut is a lot less than the difference between liberals and conservatives nationwide. There are certainly going to be extremes on both sides, but nationwide the divide is just so deep that I wonder if we could do it.
Well, I'm kind of curious. You said that liberals and conservatives don't talk to each other, but you've created a site where they do talk to each other.
They yell at each other.
They yell at each other.
We yell at each other.
I'm aware of a lot of yelling at each other between conservatives and liberals, and I mean, all of us have participated or been party to flame wars, which are...
Sure.
So is that not talking?
It's not productive.
So you're saying there's no productive conversation, but there is.
We yell at each other all the time. We scream our positions at the top of our lungs at the other side, but we don't listen to them. Maybe there are good ideas on the right. Maybe for people who are on the right, maybe there are. I know you don't believe me. Maybe there are good ideas on the left, and there are. This is my experience. I've done a lot of reading on both sides. There are good ideas on the right. There are good ideas on the left, and if we can find a way to mesh those ideas together, if we can find a way to hear each other out, work out productive compromises, I think we can really move forward.
But see, what I'm trying to point out is that you just said that we don't talk to each other, and then you said we do talk to each other, we just don't listen. And what I think what's coming out, and those are not the same thing. Those are actually mutually exclusive. And the reason I'm bringing that out is because it points to a fundamental discomfort that American public has right now with disagreement. So disagreement and argument and vitriol is okay. It's not that big a deal. And I think we've become accustomed to a society where we have to speak in moderated tones with no passion and make sure that nobody is impolite and uses dirty words or anything like that. And that's to the point where we have people saying that if you're not speaking in low tones, in moderate, not using foul language, then you're not talking. Well, I actually would argue that yelling at each other is communicating. And I think it's weird to say that it's not communicating.
Well, no, see, I have to disagree with you about that because I think there's been a gigantic industry in America, at least starting in the 90s, if not before, that involves, on Fox and places like that, people screaming at one another. And in fact, Jon Stewart I actually thought Jon Stewart was wrong this time, but in that celebrated moment where he went on Crossfire and attacked Tucker Carlson and everybody else for having a show where people scream at each other because that apparently is a very profitable thing. People apparently enjoy watching something like that, or I assume CNN would not continue to have shows like that if it weren't making money. I think there is that, and what there isn't very much of, and maybe there's another distinction that we need to make. I mean, one nice thing about Connecticut local politics is that occasionally, not very often, but occasionally, if you read down the comment thread, there's this kind of Hegelian moment where somebody says, well, okay, you remember the thing I said about your mother, like 5 comments up there? I take that back. And maybe you do have a slight point about Chris Shays or something like that. I mean, there are these occasional moments where people do sort of listen to one another. And I actually don't think that there's any dearth of raucous discourse in America or spirited disagreement. I think there is a dearth of any kind of moments of synthesis.
But wait a second here. I mean, look at what happened after 9/11 for 2 years, where we didn't even debate whether there was whether there should be a war in Iraq. Mm-hmm. I mean, you're just sort of glossing over a substantial amount of history. And I believe in bipartisanship, and I'm working on a bipartisan program right now to open up the Congress right now to Web 2.0, and right-wingers really are interested in transparency. There are areas of alignment, and good ideas can come from anywhere. But I really feel like making the argument that there's been raucous discourse because of Crossfire, which is trivial, stupid, and got bad ratings, is an insidery, too. I don't know who Paul Begala is, but he certainly has he's not in touch with normal people. The normal voices, normal disagreement is not part of American culture, hasn't been part of American mass media for a long time.
But I don't think we're seeing normal disagreement necessarily especially on blogs. I think we're seeing just the very loud support of one side. And we're not hearing the other side at all. I think it's a good idea for us to have debate. I think it's a good idea for us even to have loud and spirited debate. But I don't think it's a good idea for us to just become entrenched. And I think that's what's really kind of going on here, is that we yell at each other so much, we get defensive of our own positions, and we don't budge. And I think that this is very common now in politics. And after 9/11, what you had was one side shouting, and you had the other side quiet. And now you have 2 sides shouting, but we're still not really getting anywhere.
Well, I don't agree with that. I mean, you saw an election with a substantial outcome. I mean, this is sort of the democratic process has been restarted. But part of the issue is that you didn't have a lot of people shouting. And if you look out there's an audience of people that are sitting that are disempowered, that have no capacity to speak. And if you look into the camera, you'll see that there's a television audience out there that is disempowered and cannot participate, except on the internet. Now, maybe they're entrenched in their opinions or maybe they're not, but it's a good thing that they can participate. It's a good thing that they can come on and that they can disagree. And I'm all for saying that listening is a very nice and good thing and a happy thing to have happen. But the fact is that we have really substantive disagreements in this country. We need to hash them out. We need to hash them out sometimes with vitriol, sometimes with aggressive rhetoric, and that's a good thing. And that people are learning and they are listening, even if it's not always comfortable.
I just want to stop you about one thing about the September 11th thing, because I've had a moment to think about this, too. And I think the problem after September 11th was that nobody was capable of any kind of, once again, measured, nuanced conversation. I mean, I can tell you, more than anybody sitting up here on stage, because I, in fact, was on the air every day after September 11th. And what I was saying was, in fact, maybe, obviously, we've been hurt. This has been a very evil act, but maybe we actually need to think about why this happened, what's going on in the Middle East, that there would be such a powerful movement against us. I'm not legitimizing it, but why did it happen? Just for that, there were literally hundreds of people calling my bosses, demanding that I be fired on the spot for suggesting that there was anything to think about other than bombing this thing, flat as glass, bombing the entire Middle East. And that was the problem, that there wasn't any measured, rational ability to think clearly. Not that there wasn't enough screaming from two sides, and I think that's the thing it's sort of what you're saying. How do we ever get anywhere if all we ever do is scream, whether one-sidedly or two-sidedly?
But again, it's 15 million people marched against the Iraq War before it happened. You can't say, and you were talking about this, you can't say that there were no measured voices about this and that one side was shouting and that the other wasn't, and just gloss over the fact that we went to war, that there was basically no debate about it in the halls of the Senate and in our mass media. And Janine Garofalo, who I have a lot of respect for, but still is not sort of a recognized expert on national security, was the voice of the left on cable news. That's crazy. That's just crazy. Hans Blix was saying that it was not clear that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and he was smeared. This is a very, very corrupted and corroded media system, and you cannot say that it's just because one side was shouting and now the other side is shouting. The problem is that the right wing was shouting, and they were wrong, and they were dishonest about it. And the left is getting up and saying, you're wrong, you're dishonest, and is backing up what they do with credible information. And they're still not getting respect on media, and they're still not getting respect in the political system, even though that's where the public is. And that's not just because both sides are shouting, and I reject that.
Yeah, that's where the public is now, but that's not where the public was then. That was the problem.
15 million people.
Yeah, 15 million people. But I made that case too. I was one of those people saying don't go to war. You can't sell ice cream to
The majority of the country wanted UN authorization before the Iraq War if we were going to go to war. The majority of the country wanted to go to war, but also said we should do it under UN auspices. That just didn't appear in our public discourse at that time, even though that's what the public thought.
Now, would that happen today?
No.